There is something truly special about Lamborghini's flagship models, but it might not be for the reasons that you think. If you wanted to buy a supercar from a storied automaker with a super rich history in motorsport, you would buy a Ferrari. If you wanted to buy a supercar that was on the bleeding edge of technology and consistently comes in at a lower price than its competition, you would buy a McLaren. And if you wanted to buy a car that you knew was going to be respected online, you would buy a Porsche GT car. But if you want a supercar that is focused on excitement and emotion, a vehicle that is going to inspire an entire new generation of car enthusiasts, you buy the original supercar, a V12 mid-engine flagship Lamborghini. Now, to understand how Lamborghini's flagship product came to be, it's important to know a little bit about the early history of the company. Of course, the story is pretty well known at this point, but in the early 1960s, the company was founded by the Italian entrepreneur Ferruccio Lamborghini. And while Ferruccio was involved in a myriad of different industries, the one that we usually associate him with was building tractors. And through all of these different business ventures, Ferruccio was able to accumulate a good sum of wealth that he spent on things like cars, and in particular, Ferraris. And while he was mostly a fan of these early Ferrari models, he had a few big issues. Mainly that the cars required frequent and extensive service, and they were pretty ill-suited for road trips because they were basically just like street-legal race cars. And more broadly, just the after-sales customer service experience with Ferrari was awful. So this frustration led Ferruccio to create his own car company, Automobili Lamborghini. And the very first Lamborghini models had a very strong resemblance to the Ferrari models that they were intended to be competing against. Specifically the 350 and 400 GTs, which were the first production Lamborghini models. But it would really be the Miura and that car's successors that would not only change the game for Lamborghini, but for the entire car market. And the Miura is widely considered to be the first supercar. And you can mainly attribute that to two things. The first being its V12 engine, and the second being the placement of that engine in the middle of the car. Because up until the Miura came out, there was no mid-engine, rear-drive, ultra-high-performance vehicles. And this turned out to be a big success, because when it came out, the Miura was the fastest production car in the entire world. And whether they intended to or not, with this car, Lamborghini basically invented a new segment of cars where moving forward, any ultra high performance serious automobile is going to feature a mid-engine design. And in addition to the impact on the industry, the Miura was incredibly important for Lamborghini, the car company. Up until the release of this car, Lamborghini was always kind of floating on the edge of legitimacy, but the Miura solidified that, and it also proved to be their new flagship product. While the Lamborghini lineup has gone through a lot of change over the last 60 years, with adding new entry-level models, discontinuing them, and now selling an SUV, their core product has stayed the same with these V12 mid-engine supercars. So to circle back around to the Miura, it started production in 1966 and would eventually be discontinued in 1973 and replaced with the Countach. Now, the Countach took over the mantle from the Miura in the sense that it was also V12 and mid-engine, but it made a lot of improvements in terms of things like serviceability and high-speed stability. But by far and away, the biggest change with the Countach was the styling. Where the Miura was smooth, elegant, and timeless, the Countach was angular, sharp, and aggressive. If the Miura was kind of like the proof of concept that this type of vehicle would be successful, the Countach was essentially like the maximalist interpretation of that, just taking everything to 11. And this turned out to be pretty successful for Lamborghini. They sold around 2,100 Countaches, which is about 3 times as many of what they were able to move with the Miura. But more importantly, it just made Lamborghini and their flagship supercars a fixture of pop culture, and the Countach in particular, an icon of the 1980s. After being produced from 1974 to 1990, the Countach was replaced with the Diablo. The Diablo might be the car in this lineage that gets the least amount of love, but I don't really think there's a good reason for that. The most important thing to know about the Diablo is it kept the same basic formula intact. Mid-engine V12, but it would start to introduce some changes with things like optional all-wheel drive and an open top. The Diablo would also be the first Lamborghini to crest the 500 horsepower mark. On the styling front, I really think of the Diablo as kind of being a transition car. It carries over some of the elements from the Countach, like the pop-up headlights, some of the aggressive bodywork and vents on the side of the car, but overall it isn't quite as angular and it isn't quite as abrasive. Now, that's not to say that this car is in any way understated, because again, it is still a flagship Lamborghini and the styling is a big selling point. But I just don't think it's quite as in your face, and maybe it might be starting to be a little bit more focused. And really with this car is where I think you start to see the modern silhouette coming to form. It has a short front deck, these long doors in this kind of overall sloping shape, and just the general proportions align pretty well with the cars of today. The Diablo would run from 1990 till 2001 when it was replaced with the Murcielago. Now, admittedly, the Murcielago is a car that I have an incredible amount of affinity for because it was basically my dream car for my entire childhood. And you could also make the argument that the Murcielago was really like the last old school Lamborghini. While it did introduce things like an automatic transmission, or more accurately, an automated manual, it still kept around the same V12 engine that was found in the Miura. And yes, you heard that right. While it grew and it evolved over the years, the V12 engine that you could find in the Murcielago can directly trace its lineage back to that original engine that was found in the Miura. The Murcielago would also be the last of these cars to feature a manual transmission. Now, the other factor at play here as to why we say this is the last old school Lamborghini is because of Lamborghini's ownership. For much of the company's history, they have been in financial turmoil, constantly taking outside investment and changing ownership. What this actually ended up resulting in terms of the product is that a lot of these cars kind of had weird little idiosyncrasies. Some people would call them design flaws and other people would call them quirks that give the car's personality. So in 1998, Lamborghini was absorbed into the Volkswagen Group. While this certainly did beef up their engineering prowess, it at the same time undoubtedly kind of homogenized them to the rest of the car market. So with the Murcielago mostly having been developed prior to that acquisition and carrying over a lot of parts from the Diablo, that is why a lot of people consider this to be the last old school Lamborghini. Ultimately, the Murcielago would be discontinued in 2010 and replaced with the Aventador. The Aventador would feature a new V12 engine that was a departure from the engines that had come in all of the cars before it. In many ways, this car was a very big step forward for Lamborghini. It was the first model to be fully developed and produced under Volkswagen's ownership, and it was also more on the bleeding edge of technology than a lot of the other cars that had come before it relative to its time. Partially because of that new engine, but also because of its carbon fiber monocoque and increased emphasis on aerodynamics. But an area where the Aventador would be lagging behind was with its transmission. This car still featured an automated manual opposed to a dual clutch. Now, in the early 2000s, automated manuals were the norm, but by the time the Aventador came out in 2011, the dual clutch was already around for a couple years and was really starting to take over. Of course, we all know that dual clutches are quicker, faster, smoother, and objectively are a better transmission. So the reason Lamborghini gave as to why they didn't put a dual clutch into the Aventador was some combination of weight, packaging, and that a dual clutch couldn't take the power from the engine. But I suspect another reason is just because the Aventador isn't a car that is focused on providing the objectively best driving experience. It is meant to be dramatic. It's meant to be an event to drive this car, and that is something I think the automated manual still provided. And the Aventador's run would come to an end in 2022 when it was replaced with the Revuelto. And in many ways, the Revuelto is an evolution from the Aventador, but with a few very important updates. First and foremost is the transition to a hybrid powertrain. And this is going to be a controversial take, but how they ended up executing this is nearly flawless. It features a tiny little electric battery with 3 electric motors and a massive naturally aspirated V12, and all of those combined make over 1,000 horsepower. Really here, the transition to a hybrid powertrain was more for compliance than anything else. Sure, it has 6 miles of electric-only range, but I doubt anybody is going to be using that for more than just backing out of their driveway. The star of the show here is still that big NA V12. And more importantly, adding the battery and the electric motors is going to allow Lamborghini to keep the V12 alive for as long as possible. Because to zoom out here, there are easier ways to generate horsepower in 2025 than with a big NA V12. Both Ferrari and Lamborghini have shown that putting a ton of boost into either a V6 or a V8 can be just as effective. But that's just not the point of this car, and that type of powertrain would not provide the same experience. I would argue that since the Countach, Lamborghini's flagship cars have been just as focused on eliciting excitement and emotion as they have been focused on performance. These cars have become cultural icons in a way that just doesn't happen all that often. Partially because Lamborghini will let one of these models run for a lot longer than other car companies let their supercars run for. And also because everybody just knows these are the flagship Lamborghini products. When you see this car with its sharp angles, you see the doors go up, you hear the high-pitched exhaust note, even if you are not an automotive savant, you recognize what this car is. And I believe every time one of these cars gets driven in public, it elicits such a reaction out of people, especially the younger generation, that it is basically creating car enthusiasts everywhere you go. And that is an important defining factor of a supercar. The styling and the sound, the exotic nature of the vehicle is part of what makes it a supercar. And what ends up happening from a business perspective, when an automaker has a car like this, they're able to successfully cash in on their brand recognition by coming out with more entry-level models. Over the past decade, that has really been the Lamborghini Huracan, which has kind of just been known as the baby Lambo. But maybe the smartest decision as of late was to come out with the Urus. And I really don't care about what the purists have to say here and whether this is a real Lamborghini or not. Because if they're able to sell this and it allows them to continue selling the flagship V12 models, I'm here for it. So there are a lot of reasons why you can hate on these flagship Lamborghini models for not being the fastest, for not being the most advanced, for not being the most reliable, for a whole suite of things. But what you have to recognize that this is an extremely important car for the automotive community, and it is unique in its focus. The V12 flagship Lamborghini is the definition of a supercar.